The harsh German winter of 1944 bit at the frozen earth as the pencil moved across the frost-covered surface, scratching out words that would haunt military records. It was December 16th, just after 6 in the morning, and Hauptmann Klaus Richter of the 12th SS Panzer Division was documenting something that defied explanation. The Americans had unleashed something new, something that violated every principle of warfare he understood. His soldiers were dying in their defensive positions, torn apart by artillery that exploded not on impact, but somewhere above their heads in the cold air itself. Through the morning mist rolling across the German countryside near Höfen, Richter had watched an entire battalion attempt to move across open ground. What followed wasn't the conventional artillery duel he knew from years of warfare. These shells weren't ordinary. They didn't need direct hits. They didn't detonate from time-fused mechanisms that required precise calculations. Instead, they seemed to know exactly when to burst, exploding roughly 30 feet above the ground and sending lethal fragments raining downward in patterns that no trench, no foxhole, no entrenchment could stop. In 3 minutes, 720 German soldiers lay dead or dying. The survivors who dragged themselves back to safety were broken, their minds fractured by what they'd experienced. They repeated the same words over and over, their voices hollow with shock. Die Luft tötet, the air kills. Richter didn't understand what he'd witnessed. He had no way of knowing that he'd just seen the combat debut of America's most carefully guarded secret weapon. This wasn't just another piece of military hardware. It was something revolutionary, a device that would increase artillery effectiveness by 1,000-fold, save tens of thousands of Allied lives, and transform warfare itself at its core. It was called the proximity fuse, and it represented humanity's first truly intelligent weapon, a miniature radar system compressed into an artillery shell. This thinking munition would prove more decisive than almost any other secret weapon developed during the war, surpassed only by the atomic bomb itself. The mathematics were staggering. Where conventional shells needed 500 rounds to destroy one enemy aircraft, proximity-fused ammunition needed only 155. Where traditional artillery killed soldiers hiding in trenches only 5% of the time, these new shells achieved casualty rates of 70%. When London faced the impossible onslaught of V-1 flying bombs, proximity fuses would destroy 79% of the incoming missiles within 4 weeks. But this story didn't begin in American laboratories. It started in Britain's darkest hour, when survival itself seemed like a fading dream. October 30th, 1939, in the city of Exeter, England. As winter's first chill settled across Britain, a young scientist named W.A.S. Butemont submitted a proposal to the air defense establishment that would reshape how wars were fought. Working alongside colleagues Edward Shire and Amherst Thompson, Butemont had conceived something that sounded like pure science fiction, an artillery shell capable of independent thought. The idea emerged from cold, brutal mathematics. During the First World War, anti-aircraft gunners had burned through an average of 8,500 shells just to destroy a single enemy aircraft. By 1939, with planes flying faster and higher than ever before, that ratio had grown even worse. Britain's survival in the coming air war would depend on finding a way to dramatically improve those odds. Butemont's answer was elegant in its simplicity, yet terrifyingly complex in its execution. Radio waves could detect approaching aircraft and trigger shell detonation at precisely the right moment. But he faced a problem that seemed utterly impossible with the technology available in 1939. His radio fuse would need to withstand the crushing forces of being fired from a gun, forces exceeding 20,000 times normal gravity. It would need to spin at 30,000 revolutions per minute. It would need to function in temperatures ranging from 50 degrees below zero to 100 degrees above. Despite all this punishment, it still needed the sensitivity to detect aircraft 70 feet away. British scientists built prototypes by June of 1940, testing them in unrotated projectiles, essentially primitive rockets fired at balloon targets. The tests proved the concept could work, but they also revealed the crushing technological challenge ahead. No electronic component that existed could survive the violence of being fired from a gun. The solution would have to come from across the Atlantic, delivered by one of history's most crucial scientific missions, arriving at Britain's moment of greatest desperation. September 6, 1940, Halifax, Nova Scotia. The Canadian Pacific liner Duchess of Richmond steamed into the harbour, carrying cargo more precious than gold itself. Inside the ship's hold sat Sir Henry Tizard and a black metal box containing every major British military secret. The Tizard mission, as history would remember it, represented an unprecedented gamble. A nation fighting for its very survival was about to share its most closely guarded military technologies with a country not yet even at war. The British delegation arrived in Washington on September 12th, taking rooms at the Wardman Park Hotel. For an entire week, they revealed Britain's technological treasures: radar systems, jet engine designs, explosive technologies, chemical weapons research. But on September 19th, in a conference room looking out over Connecticut Avenue, a British physicist named Dr. John Cockcroft presented something special to a young American physicist who had been summoned for this specific meeting alone. Dr. Merle A. Tuve was 39 years old, and as Cockcroft explained the British proximity fuse research, Tuve found himself transfixed. Tuve had grown up in rural South Dakota, spending his childhood building and tinkering with radio sets, alongside his friend Ernest Lawrence, who would eventually win the Nobel Prize in Physics. Just 1 month earlier, in August of 1940, Vannevar Bush had appointed Tuve to lead an entirely new secret section of the National Defense Research Committee. Section T had been created specifically to develop proximity fuses. Tuve's appointment wasn't random chance. Earlier that same summer, he'd been listening to radio broadcasts of the London Blitz with his wife Winnie. The broadcaster's voice described children being pulled alive from rubble, entire neighbourhoods erased in minutes, the desperate, aching inadequacy of British air defences in the face of relentless bombardment. Tuve had turned to his wife with tears streaming down his face and said the words that would define his mission. "We have to find a way to stop those bombers. Technology has to provide the answer." Now, sitting in that Washington conference room, Cockcroft was offering him exactly that chance. Yet the British concept, brilliant as it was, remained theoretical. No one had solved the fundamental problem: how to make vacuum tubes and electronic circuits survive being shot from a gun. Cockcroft was honest about Britain's limitations. The nation lacked the industrial capacity and resources needed for the massive development program that would be required. America, with its enormous industrial base and protected geography far from any enemy, represented the only realistic hope. When Tuve left that meeting, he carried with him a mission that would consume the next 5 years of his life and mobilize an entire American industry. The challenge seemed impossible. The solution would require innovations that hadn't yet been invented, manufacturing techniques never before attempted, and production on a scale that defied imagination. December of 1940, in a mansion at 5241 Broad Branch Road in Washington, D.C., the Department of Terrestrial Magnetism at the Carnegie Institution had been transformed into the nerve center of America's most secret weapons program. Tuve had assembled a team that would fundamentally reshape warfare itself. Richard B. Roberts was a nuclear physicist who had worked with Ernest Rutherford. Henry H. Porter brought expertise in acoustics. Robert B. Broad had studied cosmic rays. Lawrence Hafstad specialized in nuclear physics. Lloyd Berkner was a pioneer in ionospheric research. And there was a 26-year-old physicist named James Van Allen, whose later discovery of Earth's radiation belts would bring him fame, but whose wartime contributions would remain classified for decades. The challenge they faced shattered every assumption about what electronics could do. The proximity fuse had to be a complete radar system. Transmitter, receiver, amplifier, and detonator, all compressed into a space smaller than a coffee can. It had to generate radio waves, detect their reflection from targets, process the signal, and trigger detonation. All of this while experiencing forces that would destroy any conventional electronic device. Van Allen took on the most fundamental problem. He needed to create vacuum tubes that could survive being fired from a gun. Traditional vacuum tubes with their delicate glass envelopes and fragile filaments would shatter when subjected to forces of just 100 times gravity. The proximity fuse would need to survive acceleration 200 times greater. For 6 months, Van Allen worked alongside engineers from Raytheon, a Massachusetts company that manufactured hearing aids. Together, they developed miniaturized tubes with revolutionary internal construction. Instead of hanging filaments from delicate wires, they created rigid structures using techniques borrowed from hearing aid manufacturing. The breakthrough came in January of 1942, when Van Allen invented what he called the mousetrap spring, a mechanical system that protected tube filaments during the massive acceleration of being fired, then released them for normal operation once the shell was in flight. The patent for this innovation wouldn't be declassified until 1947, but it represented one of the most important electronic discoveries of the entire war. Lloyd Berkner achieved another crucial breakthrough in December of 1940, developing a circuit design that used separate transmitter and receiver functions. This represented a significant advance beyond the British Autodyne concept. His innovation allowed the fuse to detect targets at greater distances with much higher reliability, something absolutely essential for effective combat performance. By March of 1942, the project had outgrown the facilities available at Carnegie. Johns Hopkins University established the Applied Physics Laboratory in an abandoned Chevrolet dealership at 8621 Georgia Avenue in Silver Spring, Maryland. The building still smelled of motor oil and rubber when the first scientists walked through the doors, but within weeks it had become the most advanced electronics laboratory in the world. Merle Tuver became APL's first director, establishing a laboratory culture that would define American weapons development for generations to come. Signs appeared on every wall throughout the facility. One read, "I don't want any damn fool in this laboratory to save money. I only want him to save time." Another sign displayed the philosophy that would drive them forward. "Our moral responsibility goes all the way to the final combat use of this unit. Its failure there is our failure." The technical specifications of what they accomplished seem impossible even by today's standards. The proximity fuse functioned as a continuous wave radar system, transmitting at frequencies between 180 and 220 MHz, frequencies that in 1940 were considered cutting-edge radio technology. The projectile's metal shell body served as the transmitting antenna, excited by a small conical antenna mounted in the nose. The entire system employed an Autodyne configuration where a single oscillator tube functioned as both transmitter and receiver. It was elegant design born from brutal space constraints. Inside a space barely 5 inches long and 2 inches in diameter, they packed 4 miniaturized vacuum tubes, 130 electronic components, a wet cell battery, multiple safety mechanisms, and the detonator system itself. The oscillator tube generated a 70 MHz signal with harmonics extending to 180 to 220 MHz. When these radio waves bounced off approaching targets, they created interference patterns that varied the oscillator loading, producing beat frequencies in the 200 to 800 Hz range. These signals were amplified through a 2-stage amplifier, filtered for the specific frequencies that indicated an approaching target, then triggered a thyrotron gas-filled tube that initiated detonation. The power source represented another seemingly impossible innovation. Traditional batteries couldn't survive the G-forces or provide sufficient power in such a tiny space. The solution came from National Carbon Company, which developed a revolutionary reserve battery using liquid electrolytes stored in a glass ampule. When the gun fired, the shock would shatter the ampule. Centrifugal force from the shell's spin would drive the electrolyte into stacked carbon and zinc plates, activating the battery during flight. This meant the battery had unlimited shelf life before use, but would provide full power exactly when needed. Safety systems prevented premature detonation through multiple layers of protection. Centrifugal switches remained open until the shell reached proper spin rate. A delay of between 0.5 and 0.7 seconds after firing prevented detonation near friendly forces. The sensitivity increased gradually during flight, reaching maximum effectiveness at typical engagement ranges. January 5, 1943, just after 8 in the morning, near Guadalcanal in the southwest Pacific. USS Helena's radar operators detected incoming aircraft, 4 Val-dive bombers approaching at 12,000 feet. Lieutenant Russell Red Cochrane commanded the after 5-inch battery and had been briefed on the new ammunition just days before. Down in the magazine below, gunners loaded shells marked with special green bands, the Navy's designation for proximity-fused rounds. The rangefinder operator called out the distance, 8,000 yards and closing. Cochrane raised his binoculars and watched the approaching planes. In conventional combat, his guns would need direct hits, nearly impossible against maneuvering aircraft. But these shells were different. They only needed to pass within 70 feet of the target. "Commence firing," Cochrane commanded. The first salvo erupted from Helena's guns, shells tracing red arcs across the morning sky. The shells passed near the lead valve, but nothing happened. They were still too distant. 15 seconds later, the second salvo followed. At 5,000 yards from Helena and 11,000 feet altitude, one shell passed approximately 60 feet from the lead bomber. The explosion that followed looked completely different from anything Cochrane had ever witnessed in combat. Instead of the shell continuing past the plane or detonating on impact, it burst in mid-air. A perfect sphere of fragments erupted outward. The valve's wing sheared off instantly. The engine, peppered with hundreds of steel fragments, burst into flames. The aircraft didn't break apart in some dramatic fashion. It simply stopped flying, transforming from a controlled dive bomber into a tumbling mass of burning aluminum. The spotter called it out. Splash 1. The remaining valves broke off their attack, but Helena's guns tracked them anyway. 3 more salvos followed. 12 more proximity-fused shells found their targets. A second valve exploded when a shell detonated 40 feet below its fuselage. The upward-directed fragments pierced the fuel tanks and killed the pilot instantly. In the radio room, combat officers were already encoding the report. Enemy aircraft engaged with special ammunition. 2 confirmed destroyed. Ammunition performance exceeded all expectations. What the official report didn't capture was the psychological impact on Helena's crew. First-class mate Anthony Pucci would later recall the moment with wonder in his voice. "We couldn't believe it. For months we'd fired thousands of rounds at Japanese planes, and if we were lucky, maybe we'd hit one. Now we were knocking them down with just a few shots. It was like God himself was guiding our shells." Samuel Eliot Morrison, the Navy's official historian present in the Pacific, would write about the moment in his records. The smoking fuselages and bright surface bonfires attested to the accuracy of anti-aircraft batteries and the efficiency of the super-secret Mark 32 proximity-fused shell. The impact rippled through the Pacific Fleet with stunning speed. On August 12, 1942, even before Helena's combat debut, USS Cleveland had conducted a test that convinced the Navy to stake everything on this new technology. In Chesapeake Bay, the cruiser faced 3 radio-controlled drone aircraft. Sophisticated targets capable of performing evasive maneuvers. The test was originally scheduled for 2 days. It lasted less than 2 hours. The first drone was destroyed by the second burst of proximity-fused shells. The second drone was eliminated on the 4th burst. The third drone was obliterated on the first burst. The Navy observers were so shocked they cancelled all remaining tests and immediately ordered mass production of the ammunition. Admiral William Spike Blandy, watching from Cleveland's bridge, turned to his aide. "This changes everything. Every ship in the Pacific needs these rounds immediately." By spring of 1943, proximity fuses flowed to the Pacific in extraordinary quantities. The first 5,000 rounds went to USS Enterprise, USS Saratoga, and USS Helena under the personal supervision of Commander W.S. Parsons, the same officer who would later arm the atomic bomb aboard the Enola Gay. Security was absolute and uncompromising. The shells were stored in special magazines with armed guards standing watch. Only gunnery officers received briefings on their actual capabilities. Other crew members were told they were special incendiary rounds, an explanation that accounted for their different appearance. The statistics from 1943 revealed the transformation in naval combat. Although proximity fuses comprised only 25% of anti-aircraft ammunition being fired, they accounted for 51% of all Japanese aircraft destroyed by naval gunfire. The rounds per kill ratio dropped dramatically from 508 for conventional time-fused shells down to just 155 for proximity-fused ammunition. That was a 3-fold improvement, and it would only increase as gun crews gained experience and understanding. Gunner's mate second-class Robert Chen, aboard USS Essex, documented the change in his personal diary. March 1943, he wrote, "Fired 300 rounds at attacking Bettys, no hits." September 1943, new ammunition arrived with green bands. Fired 80 rounds at attacking Vals, destroyed 3. The guys think we've gotten better at shooting. They don't know it's the shells doing the thinking now. June 19, 1944, at 10 in the morning, in Philippine Sea, 200 miles west of Guam. Lieutenant James Van Allen stood on the flag bridge of USS Washington, watching the radar screens fill with approaching contacts. This was the same James Van Allen who had developed the shock-proof vacuum tubes, and now he was witnessing his inventions in their ultimate test under combat conditions. The Japanese had launched their entire carrier aviation strength, 423 aircraft, in a desperate all-or-nothing attempt to destroy the American fleet supporting the invasion of the Marianas. Van Allen had been commissioned in November of 1942 and had spent the following 16 months training gunnery officers throughout the Pacific Fleet. He knew every single ship was loaded with proximity-fused ammunition. He understood the theoretical effectiveness, but theory and actual combat were entirely different things. Raid 1, bearing 265, Angels 20, announced the Combat Information Center, 609 aircraft. Admiral Mark Mitchell issued the command: launch all fighters, gun crews to battle stations. As Hellcat fighters tore into the Japanese formations, those aircraft that broke through faced a wall of proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire unlike anything in naval history. Van Allen watched from Washington's bridge as the sky above filled with black puffs of smoke. Each one represented a proximity-fused detonation, a shell that had found its target through its own electronic intelligence. Japanese planes began falling from the sky like rain. A Zero fighter dove toward the USS South Dakota, barely 1,000 yards from the Washington. Van Allen kept his eyes fixed on the moment, the South Dakota's 5-inch guns swiveling with mechanical precision, tracking the incoming threat with smooth, deliberate bursts. The third shell ignited the sky, 50 feet from the target. That was all. But it was enough. The Japanese plane didn't burn away slowly, it didn't limp back toward its base trailing smoke. Instead, it simply came apart in the afternoon light. The wings separated from the fuselage as if someone had snapped them off with their bare hands. The engine dropped free, plummeting like a stone. The pilot's body tumbled through the void, spinning downward toward the ocean far below. It was methodical, systematic, one after another. Van Allen would write to his wife later about what he'd witnessed. It was systematic slaughter. The proximity fuses had transformed American warships into floating fortresses. The Japanese pilots showed genuine courage. Squadron after squadron kept coming, kept charging through walls of anti-aircraft fire, even as their numbers shrank, even as entire formations were wiped from existence. But courage, no matter how profound, couldn't match technology. By the end of that terrible day, the Japanese had given up 315 carrier aircraft to the depths, along with another 50 land-based fighters. American losses totaled 29 aircraft, and most of those came from accidents, not combat. The imbalance was staggering. That single engagement effectively demolished Japanese carrier aviation. They would never mount another conventional carrier strike. What came next would spring from pure desperation. A new tactic born from the realization that they had nothing left to lose. Kamikaze. Aboard the USS Bunker Hill, aviation radio man Charles Calhoun was recording everything he saw. The sky was chaos, burning aircraft falling everywhere, some in pieces, some still intact, but already dead. Some crashed down in flames. The gunners were laughing and crying simultaneously, after 2 years of enduring relentless Japanese air attacks, watching their comrades fall, watching ships go down. Finally, they were giving it back. The proximity fuses made their guns feel like instruments of divine power. They were godlike. October 25, 1944, 7:40 in the morning. The Philippine waters. Lieutenant Commander Robert Roberts stood aboard the USS White Plains, watching something that would chill him forever. A Zero fighter, already engulfed in flames from the anti-aircraft pounding it had taken, was deliberately aiming itself at the USS St. Louis flight deck. It didn't waver, it didn't attempt to escape, it came straight on. The impact detonated the torpedo warheads stored in the hangar deck below. The explosions tore through the ship's interior. Minutes later, St. Louis rolled over and sank beneath the surface. The first major warship lost to a kamikaze attack. The Japanese had found the answer to America's proximity fuses. They had discovered the single tactical approach that rendered America's technological advantage irrelevant. A conventional bomber destroyed 50 feet from its target by a proximity fuse had failed its mission. It was dead metal dropping into the sea. But a kamikaze destroyed 50 feet from its target would still crash into the ship. Momentum carried the wreckage forward. The divine wind had arrived. Statistical analysis would soon reveal the nature of this tactical revolution. Japanese conventional attacks now achieved success rates of only 2%. Between October 1944 and January 1945, they achieved 23 hits from 1,292 attempts. But kamikaze attacks achieved success rates of 34%. 121 hits from 352 attempts. The proximity fuses had made conventional attacks absolutely suicidal. So the Japanese embraced suicide itself. They made it official tactics. They made it religion. Yet even against kamikaze attacks, the proximity fuses proved invaluable. During the entire Philippines campaign, anti-aircraft guns claimed 231 kills, or deflections from 364 kamikaze attacks. A 64% success rate. Proximity fuses were responsible for 44% of all 5-inch gun kills. Without them, American casualties would have doubled, perhaps tripled. Seaman William Foms aboard the USS Nashville lived through the brutal new reality. The Japanese came at us like they didn't care about living anymore, because they didn't. Our proximity fuses would blow them to pieces, reducing entire aircraft to confetti. But confetti traveling at 300 miles per hour still hits hard. The fuses saved us from most of them, but the ones that got through, those ships got hurt. April 11, 1945, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Radar Picket Station, 1,500 miles north of Okinawa. Commander Baron J. Maloney of the USS Hadley watched his radar screen fill with symbols. Growing dread crept up his spine. Kikusui No. 6 was incoming, over 150 Japanese aircraft coordinating a massive kamikaze assault. The Hadley and the USS Evans were alone at the picket station. They were the fleet's eyes, the early warning system, the first and only defense. Multiple raids on all vectors, the Combat Information Center reported. Estimated 150-plus bandits inbound. Maloney had drilled his crew relentlessly throughout the preceding months. Every sailor knew his assignment. Every man understood his role. The 5-inch magazines were filled entirely with proximity-fused shells. Nothing else was loaded. The gun crews had practiced until muscle memory took over. They could maintain 15 rounds per minute per gun. That was the maximum sustainable rate. That was their ceiling. At 12:20, the first wave attacked, 12 aircraft screaming in from the north. Hadley's guns opened fire at 12,000 yards. The proximity fuses went to work instantly. The first plane exploded at 8,000 yards, the second at 6,000, the third at 4,000. The fourth kamikaze came in already burning, crashed only 50 yards off the starboard beam, covering the deck with debris, but causing no serious damage. This was just the beginning. For the next 95 minutes, the Hadley fought for its life against continuous waves of attackers. The gun barrels turned red hot. Metal groaned. Ammunition handlers collapsed from exhaustion and were immediately replaced by fresh bodies. The proximity fuses never ceased working, never missed a beat. Gunner's mate Second Class Robert Eberly, manning gun Mount 52, testified afterward about what he witnessed. They came from everywhere, high, low, all directions at once. The proximity fuses were beautiful, he said. We'd fire, and 3 seconds later there'd be an explosion and burning pieces falling down. Fire again, another explosion. It was like a rhythm. Boom, 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 wait 3 seconds, explosion, boom, 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 explosion. At 4:15, Hadley's luck shattered. 3 kamikaze aircraft, all heavily damaged by proximity fuse explosions but still flying, crashed into the ship in rapid succession. A bomb from a 4th aircraft detonated in the after-engine room. The Hadley was devastated, 30 men killed, 68 wounded. Engineering spaces flooded, fires raging through the ship. Yet the ship survived. The gun crews kept fighting. Even as damage control parties battled the fires and flooding, the forward guns continued engaging aircraft. They didn't stop. They couldn't stop. They wouldn't stop. When the action ended at 4:55, the Hadley had shot down 23 aircraft, an all-time record for a destroyer in a single engagement. Commander Maloney's after-action report stated clearly, "The proximity fuses were indispensable to our survival. Without them, we would have been overwhelmed in the first 20 minutes. Even damaged and burning, the fuses allowed us to continue defending ourselves when conventional ammunition would have been useless against such overwhelming numbers." The Okinawa campaign's final statistics were grim and sobering. 1,900 Japanese aircraft in kamikaze attacks, 368 US ships damaged, 34 sunk, 4,970 sailors killed, 4,824 wounded. Yet post-war analysis concluded something chilling. Without proximity fuses, casualties would have exceeded 15,000. Over 100 ships would have been sunk. The proximity fuses had made the difference between painful victory and potential catastrophic defeat. June 13, 1944. 4 in the morning. London. The distinctive pulse jet engine sound echoed across the city, a harsh buzzing that would soon terrorize millions. The first V-1 flying bomb of the main offensive impacted Grove Road in Bethnal Green, killing 6 civilians, including Mrs. Carrie Harrison, who became the first London victim of Hitler's revenge weapon. But unlike the Blitz of 1940 to 1941, London now possessed a defense that would have seemed absolutely miraculous just 4 years earlier. On June 12th, one day before the V-1 offensive began, and 6 days after D-Day, Winston Churchill had made a decision that would save thousands of lives. Against the strong advice of security officials terrified that the technology would fall into German hands, Churchill authorized the use of proximity fuses for London's defense. General Frederick Pyle, commanding anti-aircraft defense, had positioned 500 heavy anti-aircraft guns, British 3.7-inch weapons and American 90mm cannons, in a defensive belt south of London. Each gun was linked to SCR 584 microwave radar and M9 electronic gun directors. The system was sophisticated, integrated, automatic. But without proximity fuses, even this marvel of engineering achieved only 24% success rates in the first week. Squadron leader Prudence Hill, serving in the filter room at RAF Stanmore, watched the transformation unfold. "The first week was terrifying," she recalled. "We'd plot dozens of V-1s approaching London, and most got through. The guns were firing constantly, but hitting almost nothing. It was demoralizing. Then something changed in the second week. Suddenly the guns started destroying everything. V-1 after V-1 was disappearing from the plotting board 10 miles from London. The incoming symbols just vanished. She was witnessing the arrival of proximity fuses flown directly from American production lines. By the second week, gunners were destroying 46% of engaged V-1s. Third week, 67%. Fourth week, 79%. The improvement was staggering. German intelligence reported to Hitler that the British must have developed a secret anti-robot weapon. They couldn't explain the transformation any other way. Gunner Sergeant Kenneth Brown of the U.S. 184th AA Gun Battalion, stationed near Biggin Hill, described what changed. "With regular shells, we had to predict exactly where the buzz bomb would be and when it would be there. 1 second off, 1 degree wrong, and we'd miss completely. With proximity fuses, we just had to get close. The shell would do the rest. It was like going from throwing darts blindfolded to throwing them with your eyes open." On August 28, 1944, the defensive system achieved its ultimate success. Early warning radar detected 104 V-1s launched at London. The proximity-fused guns destroyed 96. RAF fighters got 4. Only 4 reached London. The V1 threat to London was effectively neutralized. The numbers told the entire story: 9,300 V1 missiles launched at London over 80 days. Approximately 2,340 destroyed by proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire. Without this defense, estimates showed additional casualties would have exceeded 20,000 dead and 50,000 wounded. Churchill would later write, "The proximity fuse, more than any other single development, saved London from devastation by flying bombs." December 15, 1944. Antwerp, Belgium. Captain William Hartmann of the 407th Gun Battalion watched the latest intelligence report with grim satisfaction. In the past 24 hours, his battalion had destroyed 89 of 92 V1s targeted at Antwerp harbour, a 97% success rate that would have been pure fantasy just weeks earlier. Antwerp was the vital artery through which the entire Allied advance breathed. Through its 26 miles of docks flowed 25,000 tons of supplies daily: food, ammunition, fuel, medical supplies. Without Antwerp, the entire Allied advance into Germany would strangle and fail. Hitler knew this absolutely. Between October 24, 1944 and March 27, 1945, Germany would launch 4,900 V1s at Antwerp, more than half the number fired at London. The initial defense of Antwerp had started poorly. In early November, conventional time-fused shells achieved only 40% success rates. V1s were impacting the port area at rates of 30 per day, threatening to close the vital supply line. Then in mid-December, a Lancaster bomber made an emergency landing at Antwerp airport. Its cargo, 10,000 proximity fuses, flown directly from Cincinnati on Churchill's personal order. Technical Sergeant Joseph Krizak, operating an SCR-584 radar unit, witnessed the immediate change. Before proximity fuses, we'd track a buzz bomb perfectly, feed perfect data to the guns, and watch our shells explode, behind, in front, above, below, everywhere but on target. After proximity fuses, same tracking, same data. But now every gun burst meant a dead buzz bomb. It was like someone had given us guided missiles. The German V1 crews, launching from sites in Holland, couldn't comprehend what was happening. Launch sites that had successfully delivered 80% of their missiles to Antwerp suddenly saw 90% destroyed in flight. They increased launch rates. They varied launch times. They tried flying V1s at different altitudes. Nothing worked. The proximity fuses destroyed them all with mechanical efficiency. Private First Class Raymond Miller, ammunition handler with the 126th AA Battalion, described the reality of sustained operations. "We were firing so many proximity fuses that we ran out of storage." Trucks would arrive from the port with new shells and drive straight to the gun positions. We'd load them directly into the guns. No inventory, no paperwork. Just shoot, shoot, shoot. In one 24-hour period, my gun position fired 1,400 rounds. That's 1,400 proximity fuses, each one a miracle of engineering burned through in a single day. By February 1945, the defense had become so effective that German V1 crews began suffering complete morale collapse. Luftwaffe Colonel Max Wachtel, commanding the V1 offensive, reported to Hitler that continuing attacks on Antwerp were simply feeding missiles into a furnace. Hitler ordered the attacks to continue regardless. They did, achieving nothing except depleting Germany's dwindling resources. The final statistics for Antwerp's defense: 2,183 V1s destroyed out of 2,394 engaged. A 91.2% success rate. The port never closed. The supplies never stopped flowing. The Allied armies continued their advance into Germany, sustained by the lifeline that proximity fuses had kept open. The morning of December 16, 1944, marked not just the beginning of Germany's last major offensive, but also the combat debut of proximity fuses in ground warfare. At 5:30 in the morning, near Monschau, Colonel Oskar Axelson of the 406th Artillery Group received frantic reports from forward observers. German forces were attacking with overwhelming strength. The 38th Cavalry Squadron holding the line was outnumbered 10-1. They would be overrun within hours. Axelson faced a terrible decision. In his ammunition bunkers sat thousands of proximity-fused shells, delivered just days before with explicit orders, not to be used in ground combat under any circumstances. Risk of capture by enemy forces was too great, but without them, the cavalry squadron would cease to exist within hours. At 6 o'clock, Axelson gave the order that would revolutionize ground warfare. Load proximity fuses, set for airburst. The first salvo landed among German infantry advancing across snow-covered fields near Hofen. Instead of exploding on impact, allowing soldiers in foxholes and behind cover to survive, the shells detonated at their optimal height above the ground. The effect was apocalyptic. Fragments rained downward in a lethal cone, reaching into foxholes, over walls, under vehicles. There was no cover, no protection, nowhere to hide. Forward observer Lieutenant Richard Rolston, watching through binoculars, reported what he saw. First salvo airburst over German infantry company in open. Estimate 80% casualties, survivors running back to the woodline. Request immediate repeat on the woodline. The second salvo airburst in the trees where German soldiers sought cover. The combination of shell fragments and wooden splinters created a killing zone 100 yards deep into the forest. German soldiers, veterans of 4 years of brutal combat, experienced something entirely new. Artillery that killed regardless of where they took shelter, regardless of what covered them. Otto Hartmann held his position as Field Wabel with the 12th Volksgrenadier Division when the barrage began. He survived the onslaught of shells, only to find himself captured just 2 days later. His interrogation report captured the raw shock of what he'd witnessed. The artillery was unlike anything we had experienced in Russia or Normandy, he told his captors. We dove into foxholes, but the shells exploded above us. The men scattered toward the forest, desperately seeking cover. But the shells followed them there too, bursting among the treetops with devastating effect. Screams filled the air as soldiers shouted that the Americans had unleashed some kind of new secret weapon. Entire platoons disappeared in mere seconds, wiped out completely. News of Axelson's success traveled fast through command channels. By December 19th, Eisenhower had formally requested authorization to deploy proximity fuses across the entire front. The approval arrived on December 21st, and within hours, every American artillery unit positioned in the Ardennes was firing shells fitted with these revolutionary fuses. General George S. Patton, never one to downplay anything, sent a report to the War Department on December 28th. His words were emphatic about what he was witnessing. The new shell with the funny fuse is devastating, he wrote. He described a recent engagement in vivid terms. The other night we caught a German battalion trying to cross the Sauer River. We hit them with proximity fuses, battalion time on target. By actual count, 702 dead. The handful of German soldiers who survived were completely broken in spirit. They surrendered without putting up any real resistance. Patton's assessment of the weapon was unequivocal. This is a magnificent weapon. But he also looked ahead to future conflicts. I think when all armies get this shell, we will have to devise some new method of warfare. He closed with gratitude. I am glad you all thought of it first. The proximity fuse, which was transforming battlefields from the Pacific to Europe, had emerged from the most unexpected sources. Converted bakeries in America's industrial heartland, former automobile garages, and factories that had once produced Christmas lights all played a role in manufacturing this revolutionary device. Transforming Mel 2V's original laboratory prototype into something that could be mass-produced represented an enormous achievement in American industry. Back in late 1942, the task had seemed nearly impossible. Each proximity fuse needed 130 precision components, and none of these had ever been manufactured at scale before. The miniature vacuum tubes alone demanded tolerances so precise they had to be measured in thousandths of an inch. Everything had to function perfectly. A single component failure meant a shell that wouldn't work as intended, potentially endangering the very Americans it was meant to protect. The production effort began with Crossley Corporation in Cincinnati. Powell Crossley Jr., who had built his wealth through radio and refrigerator sales, converted his entire manufacturing operation to produce proximity fuses. By January 1943, assembly lines were running continuously, 24 hours every single day, 7 days a week without stopping. Betty Morrison worked the assembly line at Crossley from 1943 through 1945. In a 1995 interview, she remembered the mystery that surrounded her work. We didn't know what we were making. Security was unbelievable. Workers weren't permitted to research their work, carry no one's bags or belongings, nothing at all. We sat at benches for 8 hours a day, soldering incredibly tiny components onto circuit boards. Management told us we were making radio parts for aircraft, nothing more. It wasn't until after the war ended that workers learned the truth. We discovered we'd been building the proximity fuses that saved so many of our boys. The production figures climbed at breathtaking speeds. In December 1942, factories were producing 500 units daily. By June 1943, that number had jumped to 8,000 daily. In December 1943, production reached 40,000 daily. When spring 1944 arrived, American factories were churning out 70,000 proximity fuses every single day. This vastly exceeded Germany's entire monthly production of conventional fuses. Sylvania Electric Products in Ipswich Mills, Massachusetts, became the nation's single largest producer of these devices. The company brought on 10,000 workers at its peak, with 80% being women, working in a facility that had been farmland just 18 months before the production began. The facility produced 100 million miniature vacuum tubes, achieving production rates of 400,000 tubes daily. This equaled 2/3 of America's entire pre-war vacuum tube production capacity. The human cost of this achievement only became clear decades later. Workers handled beryllium for soldering connections, completely unaware of how toxic this material actually was. Pat Vlahos's mother worked at Sylvania during those war years. In 2003, Pat shared her mother's story. She was diagnosed with malignant mesothelioma in 1983. She said she didn't know what they were building, Pat explained. It was all secret. The beryllium she handled every day for 3 years killed her 40 years later. The production numbers themselves tell the story of American industrial capability. 87 companies operated across 110 factories. At peak production, 80,000 workers were employed. From university research laboratories to Christmas light factories, from hearing aid companies to automobile parts manufacturers, American industry completely transformed to create the world's first smart weapon. The cost reduction achieved through scale was equally remarkable. In 1942, the first units cost $732 each, equivalent to $11,514 in 2020 dollars. By 1945, that cost had dropped to just $18 each, equivalent to $256 in 2020 dollars. This represented a 97.5% cost reduction while maintaining 80% operational reliability. Such a manufacturing achievement could only have been accomplished by American industry. The security surrounding the proximity fuse program rivaled the Manhattan Project itself, and justifiably so. If Germany or Japan had captured the technology and successfully reproduced it, the Allied advantage would have evaporated instantly. The security measures put in place were extraordinary, creating layers of secrecy that remained intact throughout the entire war. Captain S.R. Schumacher of the Naval Bureau of Ordnance created the deliberately misleading designation variable time fuse to obscure what the device actually did. The Army used the term posit fuse, letters that meant nothing and revealed nothing. Factory workers were consistently told they were manufacturing radio components or electronic parts destined for aircraft. Even the VT abbreviation itself was classified as secret information. Gun crews learned that VT stood for variable time, but only if they asked directly. At Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, security measures bordered on extreme paranoia. Every single employee underwent FBI background checks. The facility operated under such tight secrecy that local Silver Spring residents noticed groups of women arriving at nighttime and departing in the morning, leading to wild speculation about what happened inside that building. Security guards deliberately addressed everyone as doctor, regardless of their actual position, making it impossible to identify who held key responsibilities. The near disasters were numerous and terrifying. In July 1943, a proximity fuse shell failed to detonate properly and landed on a beach in Sicily. Headquarters immediately sent a specialized recovery team by aircraft to retrieve it before German forces could discover what had washed ashore. They successfully recovered the shell, but the incident led to new restrictions on using proximity fuses over land until the Battle of the Bulge erupted. The ultimate security nightmare arrived in December 1944, when German forces overran an American ammunition dump during their Ardennes offensive. Inside the dump sat 20,000 proximity fuses. Had German scientists recognized what they'd captured and understood its significance, they might have developed defenses against it or attempted to copy the technology. What happened instead was stunning. German engineers examined these captured fuses and reached a completely wrong conclusion. They concluded the shells were impossible. A post-war interrogation of Dr. Hans Gertien, a leading German fuse expert, revealed their reasoning. "We examined American fuses captured in the Ardennes," he explained. "We concluded they could not function as claimed. No vacuum tube could possibly survive the acceleration forces involved. The Germans believed the Americans were attempting psychological warfare with propaganda about superweapons. The Germans had the proximity fuse in their hands and didn't believe it was real. This demonstrated how far ahead American technology had actually leaped. Both Germany and Japan pursued proximity fuse development during the war years, but neither managed to achieve operational deployment. This failure would prove decisive in their ultimate defeats. Germany's efforts were extensive but fragmented across multiple organizations. The Luftwaffe pursued acoustic fuses triggered by aircraft engine noise. The Kriegsmarine developed electrostatic field fuses. Wehrmacht researchers tested photoelectric fuses. Between 1940 and 1945, German research institutions pursued somewhere between 30 and 50 different proximity fuse designs. Dr. Werner Ambowski, a leading German proximity fuse researcher, explained their situation after the war ended. "We understood the theory perfectly," he said. "We had actually provided the British with early prototypes back in the Oslo Report of 1939, but we lacked three critical elements. We needed miniaturized vacuum tubes capable of surviving the acceleration forces. We needed industrial capacity to mass-produce complex electronics. We needed centralized coordination of research efforts. The fragmentation proved fatal to their cause. While America concentrated all proximity fuse research under Merle 25 at Section T, Germany suffered from competing programs run separately by the Luftwaffe, Wehrmacht, Kriegsmarine, and SS research facilities. These organizations rarely shared information with each other. Japan's situation was even more dire. Lieutenant Commander Yuzuru Fuko of the Imperial Japanese Navy Technical Research Institute testified after the war. "We knew by 1943 that American anti-aircraft fire had become impossibly accurate. We suspected some form of proximity fuse, but we could not imagine how it functioned. We developed a photoelectric fuse by 1945 and tested it once in a dropped bomb, but we simply lacked the industrial capacity for production." Japan's response to proximity fuses became not technological but tactical. Kamikaze attacks represented an acceptance that destruction was the price of reaching the target. It was an admission of technological defeat, trading lives for the inability to match American innovation. Behind all the statistics and battle reports were individual stories that revealed the human dimension of the proximity fuse. Merle 25 carried personal demons that fueled his relentless dedication. His father had died in the 1918 influenza pandemic when Merle was just 17 years old, forcing his family into poverty. His mother took in washing to pay for his education. The words "save time, not money," displayed on his laboratory walls, reflected his understanding that in war delay meant death. After particularly exhausting test sessions, colleagues would find him alone in his office at 3 in the morning, staring at casualty reports from the Pacific. He was calculating how many lives faster production might save. James Van Allen's transformation from physicist to naval officer proved equally profound. After developing the shock-proof vacuum tubes, he insisted on combat duty so he could witness his inventions performing in actual warfare. Aboard USS Washington during the Philippine Sea Battle, he watched his tubes protecting the sailors serving alongside him. "It was the most satisfying moment of my scientific career," he later wrote, "seeing theoretical physics save actual lives." Betty Thompson worked as an assembly worker at Crossley Corporation throughout the war. It wasn't until a 1985 reunion that she discovered what she'd actually been building all those years. "For 40 years, I thought I'd made radio parts," she said. "Then they showed us a film about proximity fuses. I started crying. All those tiny components I soldered, they were saving our boys from kamikaze attacks. We had no idea we were building miracles." Lieutenant Robert Cochran fired the first proximity fuse combat shots from USS Helena. He carried the weight of that moment his entire life. In a 1975 interview, he reflected on that significant moment. "I knew we were firing something special. The security briefing made that crystal clear. But when I saw that Japanese plane just come apart in mid-air without being hit directly, I realized we had something that would change everything. It was like being present at the invention of gunpowder." Technical Sergeant Marie Collins was one of the few women permitted inside the Applied Physics Laboratory. She worked on quality control testing of the fuses. "We were testing fuses by firing them from air guns, checking if they armed properly," she explained. "One day, a fuse activated prematurely, nearly killing 3 technicians. We realized then that we weren't just building electronics. We were building weapons that had to be absolutely perfect, or Americans would die." The German perspective proved equally revealing. Hauptmann Klaus Richter witnessed the first ground combat use of proximity fuses at Monschau before being captured. Later, in 1965, teaching at the reformed German General Staff College, he would tell his students about that experience. The Americans possessed a weapon that made traditional defensive tactics completely obsolete overnight. In minutes, centuries of military doctrine became worthless. That is the power of technological superiority. The proximity fuse's impact can be measured through stark mathematics that reveal its decisive contribution to Allied victory. Naval warfare statistics tell the clearest story. Before proximity fuses in 1942, achieving one aircraft destroyed required somewhere between 500 and 2,000 rounds, depending on conditions. With proximity fuses deployed from 1943 to 1945, that same result required only 155 rounds. This represented an improvement factor of 600 to 200%. Throughout the entire Pacific War, proximity fuses destroyed an estimated 4,000 Japanese aircraft. Post-war analysis concluded that without proximity fuses, conventional ammunition would have destroyed only 650 of these aircraft. Those additional 3,350 aircraft destroyed by proximity fuses would have killed an estimated 8,000 American sailors and sunk between 40 and 50 additional ships. The V-1 defensive campaign provided equally dramatic numbers. In London, proximity fuses destroyed 2,340 V-1s. Without them, based on the early success rates with conventional shells, only 560 would have been destroyed. The additional 1,180 V-1s would have killed an estimated 9,000 civilians and wounded 25,000 more. Antwerp's defense was even more remarkable in its effectiveness. Proximity fuses destroyed 2,183 V-1s out of 2,394 engaged, achieving a 91.2% success rate. Without proximity fuses, if conventional shells had achieved only their typical 40% effectiveness rate, 1,400 additional V-1s would have impacted the port area. This likely would have closed Antwerp and strangled Allied operations across northwest Europe. Ground combat statistics from the Battle of the Bulge are equally telling. In just 2 weeks, American forces fired 200,000 proximity-fused shells. German casualties directly caused by proximity fuses ranged between 10,000 and 15,000 soldiers. Traditional artillery firing the same amount of ammunition would have achieved perhaps 2,000 casualties. The psychological impact was immeasurable, with entire units surrendering rather than face airburst bombardment. Production statistics reveal American industrial supremacy in stark terms. American factories manufactured 2,273,481 proximity fuses in total. 87 companies participated in production. 110 factories operated to produce them. At peak production, 80,000 workers were employed. The total investment reached $1 billion, equivalent to $15 billion in today's money. The cost per kill analysis demonstrates remarkable efficiency. By 1945, each proximity fuse cost $18. Each conventional round cost $502 to produce. Achieving one aircraft kill with conventional rounds required about $1,000 worth of ammunition. Achieving the same kill with proximity fuse rounds required approximately $2,190 in shells at $18 each. While proximity fuses cost more per kill individually, they achieved each kill using 69% fewer rounds overall. This reduced gun barrel wear, decreased crew fatigue, and lightened logistical burdens while simultaneously increasing defensive success rates dramatically. The proximity fuse's importance was recognized at the highest levels of Allied leadership, with testimonials placing it among the war's most decisive technologies. Vannevar Bush, director of the Office of Scientific Research and Development, provided the most comprehensive assessment. The proximity fuse created a seven-fold increase in the effectiveness of 5-inch anti-aircraft artillery in the Pacific, he stated. It formed an important part of the radar-controlled anti-aircraft batteries that finally neutralized the German V-1 attacks on London. It fundamentally changed the tactics of land warfare beginning at the Battle of the Bulge. No other development, save radar and the atomic bomb, had comparable impact on the war's outcome. General Dwight Eisenhower's evaluation carried special weight given his position as supreme commander. If the Germans had succeeded in perfecting and using these new weapons 6 months earlier than they did, our invasion of Europe would have proven exceedingly difficult, perhaps impossible. The proximity fuse gave us a decisive advantage at the critical moment. Secretary of the Navy James Forstall declared to Congress in 1945, "The proximity fuse has helped blaze the trail to Japan." Without the protection this ingenious device has given the surface ships of the fleet, our westward push could not have been so swift, and the cost in men and ships would have been immeasurably greater. Admiral Willis Lee, commander of battleships in the Pacific, was characteristically direct in his assessment. The proximity fuse made the kamikaze survivable. Without it, we would have lost half the fleet at Okinawa. General George Patton's evaluation combined tactical appreciation with strategic vision about warfare's future. The proximity fuse didn't just determine who won the Battle of the Bulge. It revealed something far more profound about the future of combat itself. Here stood weapons that possessed their own intelligence, that made decisions without waiting for human command. Churchill later reflected on this in his memoirs, recognizing that America's fortune in possessing this technology first may have altered the entire trajectory of human history. This remarkable invention saved London from the relentless assault of flying bombs. It was fundamentally a defensive tool, yet it proved more valuable than virtually any offensive weapon of the era, with only the atomic bomb rivaling its strategic importance. American industrial genius transformed complex laboratory prototypes into mass-produced shields at precisely the moment they were most desperately needed. Even Germany's military leadership, speaking frankly during post-war interrogations, couldn't deny what the proximity fuse had accomplished. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt acknowledged the crushing reality. American proximity fuses rendered their traditional defensive positions absolutely worthless. Entrenchments and fortifications became liabilities rather than assets. What they faced was nothing less than an artillery revolution they could neither replicate nor counter. While countless Allied lives were spared by this innovation, the price of its creation carried consequences that wouldn't fully emerge until decades had passed. The beryllium metal used in manufacturing became a silent killer. Workers at Sylvania, Crossley, and similar facilities touched beryllium-copper alloys throughout their shifts, blissfully unaware of the metal's devastating toxicity. Beryllium disease possessed a cruel patience, with latency periods stretching anywhere from 20 to 60 years before symptoms manifested. Hundreds, possibly thousands of wartime workers would eventually fall victim to this occupational catastrophe. Margaret Chen's experience became emblematic of this hidden cost. Her mother labored at Sylvania's Ipswich Mills facility, assembling proximity fuse components for 3 consecutive years. She felt profound pride in her wartime contribution. Then, in 1978, beryllium disease emerged. 5 years later, she was gone, suffocated by her own failing lungs. 4 decades delayed, she had become a casualty of the very war effort she'd helped win. When the Department of Energy initiated its medical screening program during the 1990s for former weapons workers, the scope of the tragedy became apparent. Hundreds of World War II electronics workers showed signs of beryllium-related ailments. Many had already passed away, never understanding that their dedicated war work had ultimately cost them their lives. Dr. Robert Meyer, who investigated beryllium disease patterns among these workers, arrived at a sobering conclusion. These predominantly female workers were soldiers in the truest sense, he explained. They handled extraordinarily hazardous materials without any protective equipment because the dangers remained completely unknown. They saved thousands of lives through their sacrifice, though that sacrifice played out across decades rather than in a single tragic moment. Beyond saving individual lives, the proximity fuse fundamentally transformed military strategy and doctrine. It forced commanders to completely reimagine tactics refined across 5 centuries of warfare. Since gunpowder's introduction half a millennium earlier, artillery had functioned primarily as direct fire or ground-burst weapons. Soldiers kept themselves alive by digging deep and staying down. The proximity fuse inverted this logic entirely. Now the ground itself became a death trap. Shells detonating at predetermined altitudes sent fragments cascading downward at angles that penetrated every foxhole, every trench, every bunker, lacking overhead protection. Major General James Gavin, commanding the 82nd Airborne Division, later documented this radical transformation. Traditional infantry tactics suddenly belonged to history. Soldiers required complete retraining. Dispersion across the battlefield became essential rather than optional. Overhead cover shifted from a luxury to an absolute requirement. Survival now meant constant movement rather than stationary defense. Naval warfare experienced equally seismic shifts. Before proximity fuses, any naval task force needed massive fighter protection against aircraft attacks. Afterward, surface ships could operate with confidence in their own anti-aircraft defenses. This newfound independence accelerated the Pacific Island hopping campaign dramatically. Admiral Raymond Spruance captured this transformation succinctly. The proximity fuse granted us tactical freedom we'd never possessed before, he reflected. Individual destroyers could now undertake independent missions, knowing they could defend themselves against air attacks. This dispersed operational capacity multiplied our fighting force exponentially. Air defense doctrine experienced total reformation. The old strategy involved filling the sky with shells and hoping for occasional lucky strikes. The new approach emphasized controlled, accurate fire with high probabilities of kills. Gun crews transitioned from volume shooters to precision marksmen. The proximity fuse embodied the first major triumph of successful Anglo-American technology cooperation. The British contributed the concept and performed initial research. The Americans brought industrial capacity and material resources. Together, this combination proved unstoppable. Neither nation possessed the capability alone to develop and deploy proximity fuses in sufficient quantities to influence the war's outcome. Henry Tizard, reflecting on this collaboration, expressed his nation's perspective. "We offered the Americans our intellectual capital," he noted. "They returned to us millions of finished weapons. It represented the most advantageous trade Britain ever negotiated." This partnership established enduring patterns of cooperation. The Proximity Fuse project became the operational model for NATO technology sharing, intelligence exchange, and joint weapons development that would characterize the entire Cold War alliance. Its impact extended far beyond military applications. Miniaturization techniques perfected for proximity fuses directly shaped transistor and integrated circuit development. James Van Allen took the shock-hardening methods he'd learned from proximity fuses and applied them to instruments aboard Explorer I, America's first satellite, which ultimately discovered the Van Allen radiation belts. The organizational template itself proved revolutionary. Universities partnering with industry, while government-coordinated efforts became the blueprint for Cold War research. Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, established specifically for proximity fuse development, evolved into one of America's premier defense research institutions. Its contributions eventually spanned from submarine-launched ballistic missiles to space exploration. Quality control standards demanding 80% reliability under extreme conditions established new benchmarks throughout aerospace and defense sectors. Statistical process control methodologies, pioneered by Western Electric for proximity fuse manufacturing, became industry standard across American production. The proximity fuse concept itself evolved directly into modern smart weapons. Contemporary radar-guided missiles, laser-targeted bombs, and GPS-directed munitions all trace their technological ancestry to that first-thinking weapon. The principle of a weapon making autonomous decisions without human intervention began with vacuum tubes inside metal casings. By May 1945, American technical intelligence teams sweeping through defeated Germany encountered shocking evidence. Inside underground facilities and hastily abandoned research centers, they discovered German proximity fuse programs far more advanced than anyone had anticipated, yet still years from becoming operational. Colonel Howard Dix, commanding Technical Intelligence Team 314, reported his findings from the Luftwaffe research facility at Fellerbrunn. German proximity fuse programs existed at every major research institution. The scientists understood the underlying principles completely. They possessed designs that potentially could have functioned. What they fatally lacked was American industrial capacity to transform laboratory experiments into mass production. The physical evidence was undeniable. At Peenemünde, where V-2 rockets underwent development, researchers had experimented with acoustic proximity fuses. At Rechlin, the Luftwaffe's primary test center, photoelectric fuses received evaluation. The Kriegsmarine facility at Kiel had manufactured magnetic influence fuses for naval shells. Dr. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, explained during interrogation what had happened. American proximity fuse shells captured in December 1944 first alerted German leadership to the concept. Our scientists initially dismissed them as impossible, Speer recalled. No electronic components could endure those forces. Once we finally accepted that Americans had actually achieved this, it was far too late. We possessed inadequate vacuum tube technology, insufficient production facilities, and most critically, insufficient time remaining. German failure illuminated the true scope of the proximity fuse achievement. It represented far more than isolated technical innovation. It embodied the complete marriage of scientific research and industrial production on a scale only wartime America could accomplish during the 1940s. Japanese efforts to comprehend proximity fuses proved even more futile. Post-war interrogations revealed profound bewilderment regarding American anti-aircraft effectiveness. Admiral Suemu Toyoda, commanding the combined fleet, testified to this puzzlement. By 1944, American anti-aircraft fire had acquired an almost supernatural quality of accuracy. He stated, "Our pilots reported shells pursuing their aircraft, detonating at precisely the optimal moment. We believed it must be advanced radar control integrated with the guns. Never did we imagine the shells themselves contained radar." Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, the officer who led the Pearl Harbor attack, survived numerous encounters with proximity fuse anti-aircraft fire. During attacks on American carriers in 1944, he witnessed something that challenged his understanding of warfare. "I watched veteran pilots simply disintegrate at altitude, their aircraft torn to pieces by shells that detonated without physical contact. We possessed no explanation. Certain pilots believed Americans had developed some form of death ray. Japanese response evolved into kamikaze tactics, representing technological surrender. Unable to match American innovation, they transformed their pilots into guided projectiles, guaranteeing the pilots' deaths in exchange for any possibility of causing damage." While Germany and Japan failed to develop proximity fuses, the Soviet Union succeeded entirely through espionage. Julius Rosenberg, employed at Emerson Radio and Phonograph Corporation, successfully stole a complete proximity fuse in 1944, passing it to Soviet intelligence handlers. This theft remained concealed until Rosenberg's arrest in 1950. By that time, Soviet forces had already deployed their own proximity fuses, constructed entirely from American designs. When the Korean War erupted, Communist forces employed proximity fuse anti-aircraft shells against American aircraft. American technology was now being wielded against its creators. David Greenglass, Rosenberg's brother-in-law, who ultimately testified against him, described Rosenberg's attitude about the theft. Julius believed stealing the proximity fuse represented something more consequential than even atomic bomb information, Greenglass explained. It could be deployed immediately. He was probably correct about its significance. Military historians consistently rank the proximity fuse among the three most decisive technologies of World War II, alongside radar and nuclear weapons. Yet unlike the atomic bomb, deployed only twice, proximity fuses saw constant combat application from January 1943 through August 1945, influencing thousands of engagements. Dr. Arnold Kramer, military historian at Texas A&M University, reached a definitive conclusion. The proximity fuse killed more enemy combatants, preserved more Allied lives, and determined more battles than any other secret weapon of World War II. Its effectiveness as a secret weapon stemmed from its ubiquity. It was used constantly, everywhere, producing devastating results. Statistics substantiate this assessment. Proximity fuses destroyed or damaged approximately 25,000 enemy aircraft. They destroyed over 5,000 V-1 flying bombs. They killed tens of thousands of enemy soldiers through airburst artillery. Allied lives preserved numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Yet beyond the numbers lay something more significant, a fundamental transformation in how wars would be fought going forward. The proximity fuse inaugurated the age of intelligent weapons. It demonstrated conclusively that technological superiority could confer decisive military advantage. It proved that democratic nations, mobilizing their civilian scientific community and industrial base, could out-innovate authoritarian regimes. Behind every proximity fuse existed human narratives of innovation, sacrifice, and determination. Merle Tuve struggled profoundly with the war's emotional weight. In 1946, colleagues discovered him sitting alone in his Johns Hopkins laboratory, tears streaming down his face. "All those young men who died while we were still perfecting the fuse," he said quietly. "If we'd managed to move faster, even by mere weeks, how many additional lives would we have saved?" He spent his remaining decades pursuing astronomical research, deliberately distancing himself from weapons development. James Van Allen transformed his wartime experience into groundbreaking space exploration. The shock-hardening methods he'd perfected for proximity fuses protected instruments aboard early satellites. When asked about his wartime work, he offered a simple response: "I helped preserve lives. Nothing else I've accomplished compares to that contribution." The female workers who soldered together proximity fuses carried their burden silently, their service remaining secret. Betty Morrison at Crossley, Marie Collins at Johns Hopkins, thousands of others whose identities disappeared into history, possessed the steady hands and meticulous attention that saved countless lives halfway across the world. Most never learned exactly what they had built until decades afterward, if they ever found out at all. Gunners who fired proximity fuses understood their significance immediately. Anthony Pucci, a gunner's mate aboard USS Helena, expressed what many felt. "Those green-banded shells felt like divine protection. Each time we loaded one, we knew some American pilot or sailor would return home because of it." The proximity fuse program consumed approximately $1 billion during the 1940s, equivalent to $15 billion today. It required 87 companies, 110 factories, and 80,000 workers. The resources invested could have constructed thousands of additional tanks or hundreds of additional ships. Was this expenditure justified? The answer emerges from battles that were never lost, ships that were never sunk, cities that were never destroyed, and most importantly, lives that were never sacrificed. Every Japanese aircraft destroyed before reaching its target spared American sailors. Every V-1 destroyed before reaching London protected British civilians. Every German soldier killed by airburst artillery couldn't inflict casualties on Allied forces. Admiral Chester Nimitz provided perhaps the most useful assessment. One proximity fuse was worth 10 divisions of infantry, 100 aircraft squadrons, an entire naval fleet combined. It represented force multiplication through superior technology, the quintessential American approach to warfare. History celebrates generals and admirals, famous battles and dramatic moments. It frequently overlooks the scientists and workers who engineered the implements of victory. Merle Tuve died in 1982, his name unknown to most Americans, despite his absolutely critical contribution to victory. James Van Allen achieved considerable fame through space research, his wartime efforts largely overshadowed. Lloyd Berkner, Richard Roberts, Henry Porter. Their names appear exclusively in technical histories. The women assembling proximity fuses remain almost entirely forgotten from popular memory. No monuments commemorate their service, no medals recognize their achievement. Yet their steady hands, their careful precision, their work with materials they couldn't comprehend, building weapons they couldn't fully understand, saved more lives than most highly decorated heroes ever did. Perhaps that obscurity feels appropriate. The proximity fuse succeeded through collective endeavor. British scientists shared their discoveries. American researchers solved apparently unsolvable problems. Factory workers assembled engineering miracles. Soldiers and sailors deployed revolutionary weapons. No singular hero emerged, but rather hundreds of thousands contributed toward a common objective. 2 weeks after that first devastating deployment at Monschau, as 1944 transitioned into 1945, Hauptmann Klaus Richter recorded his final diary entry. The Battle of the Bulge was collapsing. German forces retreated steadily. American proximity fuse artillery continued its relentless bombardment. Each airburst illuminated the snow-covered landscape with remorseless precision. We face not merely American soldiers, but American science itself. Their shells think. They calculate, they determine when to kill. We are confronting the future, and the future is defeating us. May God preserve Germany, for we have awakened a colossus whose weapons possess intelligence. Richter possessed more insight than he realized. The proximity fuse represented something more profound than merely superior technology. It embodied the inherent advantage of free societies mobilizing civilian expertise for military purposes. German scientists competed in isolation within rigid hierarchies. Japanese researchers operated in ignorance and disconnection. American scientists, British physicists, and Canadian engineers collaborated openly, exchanging discoveries and solving challenges collectively. The proximity fuse was democracy's weapon, created by free people, manufactured by free workers, wielded by free soldiers defending freedom itself. Its development demanded far more than technical proficiency. It required trust between allied nations sharing secrets, between government and academic institutions, between military and civilian sectors. Totalitarian regimes couldn't generate such trust, and that inability provided the decisive advantage. From Watson Watt's October 1939 concept to mass manufacturing by 1943, the proximity fuse traveled from British desperation through American ingenuity to Allied triumph. Throughout its journey, it rescued hundreds of thousands of lives, compressed the war's duration by months, if not years, and initiated the age of intelligent weapons continuing today. The proximity fuse demonstrated that wars could be decided not simply through courage and sacrifice, but through superior innovation and industrial capacity. It revealed that thinking weapons could expand effective force beyond anything previously imagined. Most significantly, it confirmed that free nations pooling their intellectual and industrial capabilities could achieve accomplishments that totalitarian states could merely fantasize about. In those vacuum tubes that James Van Allen taught to endure impossible stresses, in those circuits that Lloyd Berkner engineered to detect approaching threats, in those assemblies that countless unnamed women fastened with meticulous accuracy, resided the distinction between triumph and defeat, between liberation and oppression, between the world that emerged and one too ghastly to consider. The proximity fuse earned recognition as the war's most effective secret weapon, not because it possessed the greatest destructive potential, but because it appeared everywhere, continuously, decisively. It was the weapon that possessed thought, and through that thought, it helped thinking people safeguard their capacity to think freely. When German soldiers at Elsenborn Ridge huddled in bunkers that offered no protection, they encountered something transcending superior firepower. They had met tomorrow. A tomorrow where intelligence embedded within weapons would magnify human capability beyond previous limits. That tomorrow, conceived in desperate 1940, tested in World War's crucible, confirmed on battlefields spanning from the Pacific to Europe, commenced with a straightforward question. What if an artillery shell could think? The answer preserved the free world.